The next discussion we're going to have is about the coups that recently happened in the Sahel region of Africa and their impacts on migration, especially to Europe. And I would like to briefly introduce my discussion partners for today. I'm sorry, first of all, my name is Robert Gonzi, and I'm an analyst at the Migration Research Institute. And my discussion partners today are Dr. Viktor Marsai, the director of our institute, and Tibor P, Nagy, ambassador, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs of the Trump administration. So, my first question, setting the base for our discussion, would be that how did the migration patterns from Africa recently shifted?
Yeah, thank you very much, and welcoming the audience again. So just very briefly, I think we have to highlight a couple of points as regards African migration. The first is that the biggest migration patterns in the continent is rural-urban migration. Currently, 1.4 billion people live in Africa, perhaps hundreds of millions participating in rural-urban migration. And there is a very limited article and discussion about it, but this is the biggest migration in Africa. The second point is that, in general, the transnational migration patterns of Africa are not different than other parts of the world. So approximately between 3 and 4% of the whole African population who move to other countries. What is shifting in the last decade is that previously 80% of all Africans who left her or his country remained within the continent. So moved from, I don't know, Mali to Guinea. Now almost 45% of people who leave their countries in Africa move out of Africa. Almost 60% move to Europe, another between 25 and 30% move to Asia, mainly the Gulf region, and the remaining goes to America and other parts of the world. So what is shifting? More and more people leaving Africa as a continent and going towards Europe and the Gulf region. And what's new? Again, it's a new phenomena of the last decades, that the number of refugees is significantly and forced displaced persons significantly increase in Africa, actually all around of the continent. Most of them are IDP, internally displaced person. The biggest IDP crisis in the world currently in Sudan. Perhaps more than 10 million people were forced to leave their homes. But besides these armed conflicts, more and more people leave because of natural disaster and the changing patterns of the climate. So if you are reading the news, of course you're reading about Africa every day. For example, there are the huge floods currently in Kenya. Hundreds of thousands of people are forced to leave their home. And it's a paradox, because before this big flood, there was no rain for 3 years in East Africa. So the changing climate brings huge anomalies in the climate, which force more and more people. Most of them just temporary, because if there are floods come, people escaping and returning, but the patterns are there. And in general, Africa is on the move.
Ambassador, you served in numerous African countries in the last decades, and there is this myth about the development of Africa. We read a ton of articles about in the last few years that Ethiopia is going to be the next hub of Africa, and then Tigray happens. We hear the same about Nigeria, then North Nigeria happens. Same problems everywhere in Africa. Do you see any development in the continent which seems to remain constant in the future?
I can almost give you a one-word answer, which is no, but we can expand on that. We, including you, have poured trillions of dollars into African development, and Africa continues to develop, but it never quite gets there. There are a few countries that are exceptions to this, mostly in southern Africa and some of the island states. But if you look at Africa has 54 or 55 countries, depending on how you count them. But if you look at the majority of the countries, there's been very little development. Is that because of a lack of money? No. Is it because of a lack of enterprising, energetic Africans? No. The reason is because the governments have been corrupt, the governments have been inefficient, and the governments have failed to serve their people. And as long as the governments stay that way, the Europeans especially are more naive than the Americans, but we can keep shoveling money into the continent and it's going to have the same effect.
Now, an unfortunate consequence of everything you described is that there is a ton of developments, international aids and development in the continent, yet we rarely see any true progress. Maybe you, director or ambassador, do you know any projects that are good and worth highlighting to the audience?
Well, from my point of view, you mentioned Ethiopia. Ethiopia, when I was there the first time in the mid-1980s, the literacy rate was about 20%. For women, it was under 10%. Then when I went back as ambassador in 1999, thanks mostly to educational development funds coming from outside, the literacy rate was up to almost 80%, 60% for women. And when I left Ethiopia as ambassador, there were 3 national universities. Now there are 32 national universities. So again, there are high successes for individual projects or individual strategies, but in no place outside of a few countries has all of that been put together so that the entire population benefits. For example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is the richest country in the entire world, with its mineral wealth worth about $30 trillion, but it has some of the poorest people in the world, again, because of a really, really bad government. Democratic Republic of Congo has never been democratic or a republic.
Yes, about the good project. Yes, I could observe many good development projects, but the common features of them were that they were small projects, not multi-billion or multi-million-dollar projects, you know, with a huge administration, but small projects, tailor-made projects. And the second was that each cases, locals were involved. And it didn't, and it doesn't mean the local was involved that, okay, we'll do this, bringing the whole money and we'll do this. No. Local involvement meant that they provide something for the project. Perhaps 70% came from Europe or Hungary or other big organization, but 30% was invested by the locals. Because if you get something totally free, you know, you will not respect it, okay? Easy come, easy go. But, you know, if the local community invested something, you know, then you can't face the whole project, you know, because we spent, even if a small amount of money, it happened. And just a small other issue about that whole development rise or fallback of the continent, that we have to underline that the current rise of the new Cold War competition is a huge burden for Africa. Because before this new Cold War geopolitical competition, even that there were some, you know, competition and you know, different interests in the international system, there was some level of common norms. Let's say 15 years ago, if a coup happened in Africa, the whole Security Council agreed that it's a bad thing, okay? And there was some resolution that, okay, democratic order and legal order should, you know, return to the normality. Now, thanks to this competition, if there is a military coup, for example, the Sahel region, if the previous regime was pro-Western and shift to provide a Russia system, no resolution, Russia will provide the support. Or if change happened in the Chadian leadership, but the new, not so democratic leadership say, no, we keep with France, you know, there's no any, you know, message from Paris, no, you have to go back to the democratic order. And what's the problem with this, ladies and gentlemen? The inclusiveness or the lack of inclusiveness of policy. You can govern a country with 100 different ethnic groups if there's no at least a certain level of inclusiveness. Because if a group feel that they are neglected, they are not part of the game politically and economically, they will automatically turn against the regime. And when we are speaking about jihadi organization in, for example, the Sahel, a lot of marginalized groups joined to the jihadists, not because they read all the letter of Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, but they feel that the government oppresses us. We need a patron who protect us, and who can protect us. These jihadist guys have weapon, training, power. So if we provide some warrior and a safe haven for them, yes, we will fight with them against the regime.
Now, before we continue, I would like to highlight to you that there will be a chance to ask your questions later on. And we just briefly discussed before we sat down that you can ask your questions in Hungarian. Maybe you will receive the answer in English, but you can ask the question in Hungarian. Anyways, you mentioned, and it just stuck in my head, the Cold War. And we are starting to see similar pictures right now in Africa. Like a few weeks ago, there was a demonstration in Agadez, Niger, where there was this banner which said, no US, no NATO, no Biden, but at the same time displayed a Russian flag, a Chinese flag, and an Iranian flag. Yeah. And we see more and more of these pictures everywhere from Niger, from Chad, from Mali. What is happening in the Sahel? Can you shed some light what changed since the coups happened?
Yeah, isn't it amazing that in the middle of the desert, all of a sudden the people had a big, beautiful poster with Russian flags and Chinese flags.
And sorry, even more, there was even North Korean flags, so it's like a complete mess.
Yeah. No, it's unfortunately happening again, because when African countries first became independent, one of their burdens was to pick a side in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West. And we thought that that would disappear, but unfortunately it has not, because it's part of this is U.S. policy. Part of the fault is absolutely U.S. policy. Part of the fault is colonialism, French colonialism specifically. And then part of it, of course, is China now is extremely aggressive with their economic policies. And Russia is extremely aggressive in trying to show that they are still a major power in the world. So all of these combined have aided that. I would put most of the fault, though, on U.S. policy and Europeans, because the European colonial traditions in Africa carried forward from colonialism to neo-colonialism. So the French always mistreated their African partners, always. They always maintained a superiority attitude, and the Africans, of course, felt that very much. On the U.S. side, we, the United States, have interests around the world, and we divide the world into geographic regions. Each of them is important, but somebody has to be the least important, somebody, and it has always been Africa. For every administration, every U.S. administration will tell you that Africa is so important and we're going to be different, and they issue a huge policy, and it's always the same. Africa is the least important. It gets the least attention from the United States. The embassies are the smallest, and on. So when I became Assistant Secretary of State, I did a survey of all of my embassies in Africa, and I said, how many people do we have promoting trade and investment? And how many people does the Chinese embassy have in promoting trade and investment? Every single embassy, we may have one person or even half of a person, and the Chinese had 3, 4, or 5 people. So with that, you know, that's not an even fight. And the Chinese are making huge advances. The Russians are doing what I would call regime survival. And the French are losing their influence, and unfortunately, so is the U.S.
Should I speak about the European part? We are all also losing our power then. Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, just very briefly, because our time is limited. The problem is that 1 year ago, I saw that, okay, somehow we are losing ground, but there is some power sharing, okay, because anti-French sentiment is so high in all around in the Sahel region and other parts of Africa. But, you know, if the French bringing water, it's wrong. If they're taking the water, that's also wrong. So not possibility for anything. But, you know, but perhaps the Americans there and, okay, you know, changing, you know, then after the French leadership, American leadership, and anyhow the Western influence stayed. And it was very visible for me, I thought. In Niger, when the coup happened in last July, French were almost immediately kicked out. But the Americans, we can't tell whether it was a coup. It was definitely a coup. Oh, we will see. Because, you know, if they declare it's a coup, no more. We are always thinking in China, Russia, United States, the same. No. If the United States declares it's a coup, there's legally no possibility for collaboration. Immediately, you have to seize it. But the American, oh no, we don't know, we'll see. And laterly we are done. No, it was just a complete, any real, you know, how's a negotiation or sharing the tasks between the United States and France. No coordination. And just after a visit of an American
Assistant Secretary.
Yeah, I didn't want to be so, you know, so Molifi, yeah, okay. So after immediately, you know, the whole system collapsed because she was arrogant. She didn't respect the junta leadership, and she destroyed the whole connection within half an hour. So.
But arrogance can be a problem from the European side too. I remember when Emmanuel Macron, like a few years ago, visited Burkina Faso and they attacked their convoy. And then he publicly humiliated the president of Burkina Faso, and then we're expecting not to treat us like that. Anyways, but at the same time, we have ongoing conflicts, not just conflict-alike situations in the Sahel, ongoing conflicts, for example, in Sudan. What is going on Sudan? We really hear very little about Sudan. Meanwhile, it's one of the largest migration crises that's contemporary and happening. Can you shed some light on it?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real tragedy, and this is why Africans blame us, completely right, that we are biased. Because, yeah, this is the as I mentioned, this is the biggest IDP crisis in the world currently. More than 10 million people are IDP within Sudan. At least 2 million people left the country, and half of the population. At least 22 people needs humanitarian aid. And nobody knows, but according to rough estimations, at least 70 million from these 22 million are on acute food insecurity, which means that they are at the brink of starvation. And, you know, nobody's speaking about Sudan, okay? Why we are speaking about Gaza, Ukraine, and yes, it's very important, you know, that we can, it's very bad if we try to compete human suffering. But besides this, we should have to speak more about Sudan crisis. And the problem is the whole crisis really just two strong men of a nation. Both of them, Abdel Fattah Burhan, the head of the government, they were government, de facto government, and Mohamed Hamadi Dagalo, who is actually a warlord and the head of was the vice president. Both believe still in military solution. It's also a center periphery war. The establishment, the elite establishment of the Khartoum Arab leadership, while Dagalo is coming from a Rizaigat Arab tribe from the periphery, considered as not so noble tribes and like other Arabs in Khartoum. So it's also center periphery-fied. And actually the third thing that is a proxy war. Both sides is huge foreign supporters. Emirati, Russia supporting Dagalo, Egypt, Saudi supporting, Iran supporting now Abdel Fattah Burhan. So there's no end in sight. And one of the previously most stable country of the Horn of Africa or Africa is falling apart.
What I would like to add is that from your perspective, Sudan is an absolute tragedy beyond what Viktor said. Because if the international community is incapable of stopping the war in Sudan, then it's incapable of stopping any problem in the world. Because, okay, Ukraine, major problem, can't stop it. Gaza, huge problem. But Sudan, for goodness sakes, if the Security Council and if the international community cannot stop two generals who are so stubborn from fighting, you know, every week there's a new statement from somebody. Say, you know, this must stop, this must stop, this must stop. The only way the statements can do any good is if you drop the box of them on the heads of the two generals. Because without that, as long as the UAE keeps supporting one side with weapons, and as long as Saudi Arabia and Egypt support the other one, they will keep shooting until every single person in Sudan is dead. And the international community is shown to be an absolute paper tiger.
And one more add, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I mentioned previously with this Cold War competition. 15 years ago, the UN Security Council would accept a resolution or sanctions against the two generals. And they had huge wealth. Hemeti Dagalo, you know, the head of the Rapid Support Force, he earned billions of dollars by gold smuggling from Sudan with the involvement of Wagner companies to Dubai. So, you know, it's not just, you know, a general in the middle of the jungle, UN sanctions, who care. No. His whole family is in Dubai. So sanction would work. But there's no more consensus in the international system to use the norms or to follow the norms.
And now hold on, because that's not the only civil war that's going on in the region. We also have Ethiopia. What is the situation right now there at Tigray and probably the entirety of the country, because now we have a ton of different crises due to that civil war.
I spent many years in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is one of the oldest countries in the world. It is the second oldest Christian country in the world. And it's also one of those, it's very unique in Africa in that there's always lots of problems going on the surface, but underneath the surface, Ethiopia is built on solid rock. So it looks like it's going to collapse, but it never quite collapses. Ethiopia right now has at least 3, if not 4 crises going on, which would finish almost any other country. And yet it goes from conflict to conflict to conflict, and there's always Ethiopia. It's been there for 2,000 years. The United States may be gone, but Ethiopia will be there. I'm always optimistic about the long term in Ethiopia, but as previous panel said, in the long term, we're dead. So Prime Minister Abiy, the one thing all Ethiopians have in common is everybody hates him. So, you know, that I think gives him the commonality where he stays in power. But if you ask 100 Ethiopians, what do you think of Prime Minister Abiy? We hate him, we hate him, we hate him. And yet, I know him, I know Prime Minister personally, and he wants to move Ethiopia forward. But it may be the toughest job in the world, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia.
Yes, so my perspectives about Ethiopia is not as long as Ambassador Nagy. So my first time when I visited Ethiopia was 2016, so yeah, almost 10 years. And to tell you the truth, I'm still really angry for the whole elite of the country. Because, ladies and gentlemen, in the Sahel region, you can see the structural roots of the whole crisis, which is some of them beyond the capacity of the government. They could do much better, but there are the real challenges. But in Ethiopia, it's fully a man-made crisis. Okay? Because the Ethiopian politicians decide to use again the ethnic cards against each other. We don't have time to go very into the details, but actually that's all. A very limited political elites of the Tigrayans, Amhara, the Oromos decided that, okay, they are not ready to share the power, share the money, share the investment, but they decided, no, we'll go to war. And unfortunately, across the ethnicization of politics, they managed to mobilize millions of people, and nobody knows, but Perhaps they managed to massacre at least 1 million people in the last 4 years without any result. So I think it was the most useless war in human history, because when the war started 2020, Abiy wanted to eliminate somehow the Tigrinya leadership. Tigrinya leadership wanted to eliminate Abiy, and the Amharas also wanted to, if managed, get rid of Abiy, or at least control of Abiy, and eliminate the Tigrinyans. After 2.5 years of war, at least 1 million deaths, Abiy is the power, TPLF and Tigrinyan is there, and Amharas are there.
Now let's go a bit more eastern than that. So we see a rise at the Horn of Africa in the numbers of piracy from Somalia, which at first it seems like a very trivial topic, but at the same time it has serious effect, for example, on the migration patterns, because there is a migration route towards Yemen through Somalia. What is going on in Somalia? I think that's the real question.
It's very simple. Just the casting isn't going for the new Pirates of the Caribbean movies. No, that's all. No. Back to the topic. Modern time piracy and any time in history, piracy exists in places where the government is weak. There are uncontrolled areas, and Somalia is a failed state. So it was very easy, certain criminal organization to organize piracy. And the peak was in the early 2000s, between 2008 and 11. After it, both the international community and the Somali government managed to do something to reduce the numbers. But what happened in the last 6 months? A huge crisis emerged in the Gulf of Aden, thanks to the Houthi missiles. And both the international community and local actors are focusing now on the Houthi missiles to protect the ships. And thanks to the missiles, the big cargoes going much closer, distancing from the Yemeni shores, going much closer to the Somali shores. And it's very interesting. Somali pirates and whole criminal organizations, they are very adaptive. When after the rise of the Coast Guard and international patrols, they decided to invest the money instead of piracy to human smuggling. The same people arranging piracy and human smuggling from the Horn of Africa towards Europe and Yemen and the Gulf of Aden. But the capacity is there. So they realize, there's a nice cargo ship. Do you see Ali? Yeah, Yusuf. But it's very close, much closer than last time. Yeah. We can reach it with a speedboat. Let's do it. And they did it. And the last time they get $5 million, according to the rumors, for a Bangladeshi merchant vessel, Abdullahi. $5 million for a merchant vessel is good money. So until the Coups is there, they will utilize it. And, of course, beside piracy, they will continue to smuggle people across the Gulf of Aden.
I would say that Somalia is maybe the best example of a very creative people and one of the worst governments in the world, because most of those people don't want to be pirates. If they had real economic opportunities or real job opportunities, that's what they would be doing. But even for you guys, if the only thing you could get money from is being a pirate, I promise you, most of you would be pirates. But the Somali government is not a government. It's a corrupt organization. You get to be a member of the Somali parliament by buying your position because you get so much money every month, mostly from the international community. And the international community are idiots because we keep giving Somalia every year up to $1 billion or $2 billion. And it goes on and on and on. And as long as we do that, there will be Somali pirates.
And before I'm going to turn to the audience, and I'm expecting some questions. Before that, I think my final, on the record question is that we have U.S. Presidential elections this year. I do not want to mention anyone by name, but let's say if a Republican president is going to be in an office in the White House, do we see any real change in American policy towards Africa? Because the US, let's say, is in a hot spot right now in Africa.
I have to say, I certainly hope so, because we tried something new during the last administration, because what we said was, Africa's population will double between 2050, certainty. And there's only two possibilities from the doubling. One, the young people will have no opportunity, so they will join the terrorist organizations, and millions will come to you in Europe. That's one possibility. Other possibility, the governments will improve, they will have opportunities, and they will become a very strong dynamic force for global growth. That's it. So if the Trump administration comes back, the policies we will propose will be to focus on Africa's youth and also focus on trade and investment as a way to improve the environments of the governments, because you will never improve the governments by preaching at them or yelling at them or issuing statements. You will improve it by giving them real incentives, positive or negative. The negative incentive is if your population is angry, they will hang you. And no African president wants to be hung up. So we do have some possibilities, and hopefully it'll go in that direction, and we will stop issuing stupid statements.
Now the floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen. The colleague is ready there with the microphone. But if not, if you... Okay.
We can see the problems in Africa, like the crisis and massacres and so on. And you mentioned the demonstration and where the people show the banners that no UN, no US, no NATO. And they also want China, Russia, or even India or Brasilia. And mostly all of us know that there was a massacre in Rwanda in the 1970s, and there are a chance to be others like that. And if NATO and the UN, also US, moves out from Africa, and the Russians, Chinese, so on, goes their place, can they manage these problems?
You want to answer this first?
It's also very simple. Definitely no.
Yeah.
I know. It's yeah, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is that, and we have to be crystal clear in this topic. Each problem of Africa are the problem, of course, the Africans, and for Europe, because illegal migrants will not go to China, to Russia. Even the Gulf, because you see, if Saudi Arabia want to close the border, they simply shut people who try to cross. It happened regularly. So, and what's going on in Africa, according to my understanding, by Russia, is a hybrid warfare. Wagner, or now Africa Corps, a la Rommel, are there not to stabilize the continent, but to steal everything what's possible and to prolong the crisis, because crises are generating instability generating irregular migration towards Europe. It's very simple. And even irregular migration generates money for Africa Corps, because they are organizing in some places the irregular migration. About China, the position of China is a little bit different, because they want business. They need the minerals and raw materials from the continent. But again, we have to be realistic. China, at this moment, doesn't have the capacity, the military capacity, the power projection to stop hot crisis in Africa. And it's very evident that each cases when there is a hot crisis, an armed conflict there, China is stepping back.
Also, I have to say, I told my Chinese counterpart when I was assistant secretary and met with him, I said, I envy your position. I envy you so much, because China doesn't care what is happening in the country as long as they can do business. So even today in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there is a terrible civil war going on in the eastern Congo, one of the richest areas in the world. But the Chinese are there, and they are taking out the cobalt and the rare earths and sending it to China. They don't care what's going on. They don't protest about human rights violations or democratic elections. They could care less about a democratic election or any election. All they want is to make the contract and do the deal. So, no, China is not there to fix any problems except to help China. At the end of the day, the truth is every country pursues its own interests and what it sees as its own interests around the world. And that's for Russia, that's for China, that's for the United States, certainly for Hungary and for Europe.
If no, then I'm going to ask you one now. I'm going freestyle. So most of the Sahel can decide between a rock and a hard place. So they can either decide to have a completely ineffective civil government, which just fuels the problems, or having an authoritative military junta, which is coming with every aspect of an anti-democratic system. However, there's one country in the region that's doing quite well, which is Senegal. What is the secret of Senegal? What are they doing good, which the others can't?
Okay, I would not really put Senegal into the Sahel because their zones are a little bit different. Part of Senegal is certainly in the Sahel, but part is not. Senegal was interestingly one of the first countries, I think, colonized by France, and their point of view with Senegal was a little different. I mean, when France undertook colonization, their point was that eventually our African colonists will become French people. And with Senegal, they were a lot more progressive. There was a lot more education. They actually brought by some Senegalese into the French National Assembly. So even during the terrible times in Africa of all the coups, Senegal had elections. They had a forward-looking president. They have a good education system. So they have a real government. But I'm so glad you brought up this example because if the other states had governments similar to Senegal, then they might be in the same situation because all the countries are rich, with minerals, but they are so poor when it comes to government.
Yes, and again, ladies and gentlemen, the democracy is not important because it's a very nice Western idea, but because of this inclusiveness. Because the Senegalese people still feel that they are part of the system. And when Macky Sall, the previous president, tried to make some trick to prolong his power. No. The Senegalese society told no. It's no. And they were united. In the case of, for example, Mali, the lack of inclusiveness led to the Tuareg rebellion. And later, the Fulani rebellion, because another rebellion is ongoing, And the problem in the juntas is that they don't want democracy and elections, and they don't want to sit down to negotiate with other ethnic groups. It's very visible, unfortunately. And, until the point there's no possibility for other groups to get something from the cake, they will fight for their part.
Nincs más kérdés. Mondtuk, hogy lehet is magyarul kérdezni. Szóval. There you go. There's one.
Köszönöm szépen, én a nagykövet úrhoz szeretnék egy kérdést intézni. Én is itt a barátaim diplomáciával szeretnénk a jövőben foglalkozni. Engem az érdekelne, hogy mi késztette önt arra, hogy Afrika fele orientálódjon, hogy ezzel a kontinenssel foglalkozzon?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, when I joined the diplomatic service, I was a Hungarian American, and Hungary was a communist country, so I could then, even though my Hungarian is okay, I could not serve in Hungary. My family had no interest really in Asia. Latin America, I live in Texas. I lived in Texas in America. Latin America is just south of Texas. And in Africa, I could come through Budapest to see my family on the way to Africa. U.S., Budapest, Africa. So I picked Africa so I could visit my family in Hungary. And after the first tour in Zambia, we decided we loved Africa, the challenges, because it's real diplomacy. It's real diplomacy. You know, you can make a difference in Africa. What difference will you make in London, really? What difference can you make in London as a diplomat? You can make a lot of difference in Rwanda, Burundi, you know. So I went to places to work that I never even heard the name of before. Never. You know, I see Nouakchott, Djibouti, you know, Ouagadougou, places like that. But I say, yeah, I'll go, because I could come to Budapest. Anything to go to Budapest.
Okay, then I go freestyle again. We see, once again, the changes, the coups, because that's our title. One would think that a very strict military junta would be better for the migration patterns from a European perspective, because they would hold back more, or they have a more controlled authority than a civil government, which couldn't do anything beside the limits of a city where they are governing. What is the reality of it? Are the juntas better for the irregulars coming from the region, or do they make the situation for Europe even worse?
Even worse, you know, because thanks to this whole collaboration with the Kremlin, you know, what was among the first measures what the junta in Niger did, you know, they stopped the implementation of the anti-illegal immigration rule, and it has very serious consequences, ladies and gentlemen. Before this law, which was accepted 2015, 300,000 people crossed Niger annually towards Europe. 300,000. In 2016, this number from 300,000 dropped to 60,000. Okay, so 1/5. And they kept it at this level. In this year, I'm sure that we'll see another hundreds of thousands crossing. The human smugglers made huge fees there. And in the interviews, they thought, no, the business is starting again. Whole communities are preparing now to open the routes towards Europe. Because, you know, for them, okay, for us, you know, it's a criminal activity, ugly thing. No, for them, it's money. Mm-hmm. And even there are rumors, I don't know whether it's true or not, that behind the coup in Niamey in last July, there were some certain interests who wanted to re-establish the illegal migration routes, because, you know, it was at least $2 billion business per year, including some officials from or near to the government.
Kérdezni, hogy tudnák értékelni az amerikai katonai erőknek a Nigerből való kiábrudalását?
So what's the significance? It's terrible. It's horrible. Because it's a pattern. If it was the only one, then okay. But it's a pattern of U.S. policy failure across a critically important region. I mean, you know, you think about the Sahel. It is as big as Australia with 350 million people. And when we talk about Africa's population doubling, the largest population increase is in the Sahel. So the security of the Sahel is critically important. And because we did not handle Niger properly, they told us, go out of here. And it goes back to what my friend was talking about, the coups. Today's coups are not the same as the coups used to be a long time ago, because now you have the situation where you have presidents in power who extend their stay forever. Like there was just an election in Togo last week to where the president can stay in power forever. So there's no legal way to remove him. So you have a situation where the army is the most democratic institution in the country. And that's the only way to get rid of a corrupt president, basically, is for the army to go in and throw him out. Unfortunately, American law is very inflexible. That's why we waited and waited and waited to call it a coup. And once you call it a coup, then you have to take away your assistance and everything else. So it's an absolute disaster.
And of course it have consequences, as we see in Chad is following the pattern of Niger, and who knows what else is going to happen. Ambassador Nagy, Dr. Marsai, thank you very much for this discussion, and thank you very much for the audience for sitting here despite the warm weather, and have a nice rest of your day at the fest.